What's up, Matrix? Welcome to EduPen, Education During the Pandemic. And this episode is about Life Sciences Grade 12. And we will basically be dealing with nucleic acids. So there are basically 3 chapters that you will need to do for the first term. The first one, it will be your nucleic acids. The second one, it will be meiosis, which is cell division. The third one, it will be reproduction in humans and animals or other vertebrates. So what exactly are nucleic acids? Nucleic acids are large molecules that are in all living things, and there are basically 2 of them. You have the DNA as well as the RNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acids, while RNA stands for ribonucleic acids. Hence RNA and DNA. So as we all know that everything that exists in this world, it basically has to be built of something. For a house to be there, you need builders, you need bricks, you need cement, and all those other things. The same applies to our nucleic acids. So our nucleic acids are made up of building blocks which are called nucleotides. It's very important that you retain these terms in your mind, because there's a section in the question paper which requires you to know these terms. So you'll be given statements and then you have to give a term for that statement that you will be given. So a nucleotide is made up of 3 parts. It is made up of a phosphate group, a sugar, as well as a nitrogenous base. So there are basically 5 nitrogenous bases that you need to know. And if you know these 5, there's no way that you will ever get a question about nucleic acids wrong. So the first one, it will be your adenine, cytosine, guanine, thymine, as well as uracil, which you find only in RNA. So in terms of nitrogenous bases, there's also differences between DNA and RNA. So in terms of nitrogenous bases, in DNA you still have adenine, and in RNA you also have adenine, which is similar. And then in DNA you have thymine, but instead of thymine in RNA you have uracil. Always remember that. And then you also have guanine in DNA as well as guanine in RNA. You also have cytosine in DNA as well as cytosine in RNA. So the only difference is that in DNA you find thymine, but in RNA you find uracil in terms of nitrogenous bases. There are 3 main differences that you need to know between DNA and RNA. You need to know that the DNA it's double-stranded. It means it has two strands. You will see later in the lesson. RNA, it's single-stranded. And then in DNA you have thymine, while in RNA you have uracil. You also have another difference, being the fact that DNA contains deoxyribose sugar, whereas RNA contains a ribose sugar. So the diagram, or rather the figure that is shown here, it basically shows the difference as well as the similarities between DNA and RNA. So we have our nucleic acids. So you have DNA and RNA. And then the nitrogenous bases that are similar for both of them, it's adenine, cytosine, and guanine, as I've mentioned above. And the only different nitrogenous bases are thymine in DNA as well as uracil in RNA. So always remember that if you see uracil, if you see U in a strand that you will be given of a molecule, it will basically mean that that particular molecule is an RNA molecule. But if you see thymine, it means that it's a DNA molecule. And then in terms of sugars, as well as I've already mentioned, deoxyribose sugar in DNA as well as a ribose sugar in RNA. And you have the DNA, it's double-stranded. It has two strands, while RNA, it's single-stranded. So just to recap, we have two types of nucleic acids. You have DNA as well as RNA. RNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acids, and RNA stands for ribonucleic acid. And they are made up of building blocks, and their building blocks are called what? They're called nucleotides. And nucleotides are made up of three parts. They have a phosphate group, they have a sugar, which can be a ribose or a deoxyribose sugar, depending on whether it's RNA or DNA. And then thirdly, it has a nitrogenous base. And the difference between DNA and RNA, it will be the fact, in terms of nitrogenous bases, it will be the fact that DNA contains thymine and RNA contains uracil. So there are basically 5 nitrogenous bases that you have to keep in your mind, as I've said: adenine, cytosine, guanine, thymine, as well as uracil. And there are also 3 main differences between DNA and RNA that you always have to remember. The fact that DNA is double-stranded, RNA is single-stranded. DNA contains thymine, while RNA contains uracil, and the fact that DNA contains a deoxyribose sugar, whereas RNA contains a ribose sugar. So as I've mentioned that DNA, it's double-stranded and RNA, it's single-stranded. As you can see from the diagrams here, this is one strand of the DNA, strand 1. And this one is also the second strand of the DNA, strand 2. Hence, we are saying that the DNA, it's double-stranded, and between these two strands you have weak hydrogen bonds. So as you can see, what we have already talked about, this, it will be your phosphate group, a sugar, as well as a nitrogenous base. So in DNA, because it has two strands, there's pairing between two nitrogenous bases. So to always remember which nitrogenous base pairs with what nitrogenous base, you need to remember it by saying tag C. You know, on social media you always tag people on your posts. So in this in nucleic acids, you basically have to tag C. So it's simple. Thymine, it's T. It stands for T stands for thymine. It always pairs with what? With adenine. And guanine always pairs with what? With cytosine. And uracil, because we said that RNA does not contain thymine, it means that our uracil is always going to pair with adenine. So you just replace your thymine with uracil in RNA, and then you'll be good to go. As I've mentioned that RNA is single-stranded, as you can see, this is only one strand. There's no other strand near it. It also contains the phosphate group, as we've mentioned, the sugar, which will be what in terms of RNA, it will be a ribose sugar. And it also contains a nitrogenous base. So this is basically your nucleotide. A nucleotide, which is made up of three things: a nucleotide, your nucleotide, and your nucleotide. So how can you actually recognize a DNA molecule? You will recognize it by the fact that it's double-stranded, as I've already mentioned. It contains thymine instead of uracil. Adenine always pairs with what? With thymine, as I've said, tag C. And guanine always joins with cytosine. And how can you recognize an RNA molecule? The fact that it's single-stranded, it contains uracil instead of thymine, and the other nitrogenous bases, they're basically the same. The only difference, as I've mentioned, it's uracil and thymine in terms of nitrogenous bases. So the differences between DNA and RNA, they are already what I've mentioned above. DNA and RNA, double-stranded. It contains a deoxyribose sugar. It contains a nitrogenous base, thymine, instead of uracil. RNA, it's single-stranded. It contains a ribose sugar, and it contains a nitrogenous base called uracil instead of thymine. So what exactly are the functions of DNA and RNA? There are basically 5 main functions of DNA and RNA. The first one, it will be the fact that DNA and RNA, they carry genetic instructions, also known as codes. So they carry genetic instructions. Codes, in other words. Secondly, they maintain the structure and regulation of metabolism. They maintain structure and regulation of metabolism. They also play a huge role in protein synthesis. And they're also responsible for passing of hereditary characteristics, or passing on hereditary materials. And also, lastly, they are responsible for replication and reproduction. So there are basically 3 types of RNA. The first one is transfer RNA, also known as tRNA. The second one, you have messenger RNA, which is also known as mRNA. The third one, it will be rRNA, which is known as ribosomal RNA. So there are 2 functions of the RNA functions. The first function, it will be the fact that RNA is responsible for transcription of genetic DNA code into mRNA. So it's responsible for transcription of genetic DNA code into mRNA, which means that from DNA, it basically forms a code, which is also called a codon, which consists of 3 nitrogenous bases, but you will learn more about it in protein synthesis. And secondly, it's responsible for translation of mRNA into proteins. So mRNA comes with its message, which is called the codon, to the ribosome, where translation occurs and proteins are formed by tRNAs coming with amino acids. So this is the end of the lesson. Be sure to subscribe and hit that notification button so that you don't miss any content from EduPen, education during the pandemic. See you on the next episode.